Welcome to the September Sew Along. The first thing I want to talk to you about are all the supplies and tools that you will need to complete these projects. And pretty much you'll need the same tools for each one of the projects that we're going to do in the September Sew Along. Of course, you're going to need a pair of fabric scissors. These are from Missouri Star. I happen to love these scissors. I also like to have a small pair of like embroidery scissors that I keep right by my sewing machine. Helps for trimming threads, clipping corners, things like that. You may also find a seam ripper to come in handy. And if you want to finish your seams with pinking shears, you can have those handy. That's totally optional. These are from Dime Designs and Machine Embroidery. You may also need, and I highly recommend that you use a rotary cutter with an acrylic ruler and a self-healing mat. You may also find it handy to have a way to mark your fabric, such as with this friction pen. Okay, this tool here is a Hera marker. You'll notice that it has a very, I don't know what to call this, a very flat end here, and it is used for marking fabric without using ink, water-soluble ink, or a fabric marking pen. You literally press this down on your fabric and it leaves an indentation in the fabric, and you use that as your stitch guide. So this is a Hera marker. I really like to use this when I can, and I will leave links to all the tools in the description below. You'll also need a sewing machine needle. This is just a 90-14 sewing machine needle. You can use your regular presser foot, but because we'll be dealing with multiple layers, especially if you're going to use foam in any of your projects, I find a walking foot like this AccuFeed foot for my Janome machine that comes in really handy. You'll want some clips. They would just work so much better for holding your fabric pieces together than pens sometimes. And of course, some sewing pens. You may also find it handy to have a way to flatten your seams, such as this seam roller. And you'll want to have an iron. This is the Oliso M3 Pro Project Iron. It's a mini iron. And of course, an ironing surface. I use a wool pressing mat on a table that I made. You'll need thread, whatever your coordinating thread is. I just use a polyester thread. I like this thread by Gutermann. You can use your favorite brand of thread. Of course, you'll need your bobbin. I like to have a few of those pre-wound. You may also find it handy to have a smaller acrylic ruler. This is really my favorite size. This is a 2.5 inch by 8 inch acrylic ruler. And other than your fabric, fusible fleece. What else are we using? Fusible fleece and a lightweight fusible interfacing such as Shapeflex SF101 I like to use. I already mentioned the fusible fleece. And some of these, like if you're going to make the book sleeve so that it holds your electronic device such as your iPad, you may want to make yours with foam instead of the batting or the fusible fleece. I like to use the Flex Foam by Pellon. There are other brands, soft and stable, that you can certainly use, but they make for a nice padding, especially when you're going to be stowing away your electronic devices in one of the book sleeves. And other than your sewing machine, I think that covers it for all the tools that you'll need. Don't forget that if you're participating in the September Sew Along, that you share your progress on Facebook and Instagram so that you'll be eligible for the weekly prizes. So let's take a look at how to sew the Patchwork Christmas Stocking. Okay, for the Christmas stocking, you should have downloaded your pattern looking something like this. So downloaded your pattern, cut it out around the outside of the solid black line, and then taped the pieces together per the instructions. So for the patchwork Christmas stocking, this is what the bottom half of your stocking would look like for the exterior piece. Now I do recommend that you cut out two copies of the pattern. That way you have a copy for the lining piece and you have a copy for your exterior piece. So your lining or your exterior piece, once you cut it out, will look like this. And then there's also a top pattern piece that looks like this. And you'll cut out two pieces of that. These are my two for the top. So I have two, one for the front, one for the back. The same with the bottom of the stocking. It'll go together, well, actually it'll go together actually like this. And then you're also going to cut out 30 2-inch squares of fabric. So the front has 3 rows of 5 squares across, and the back also 3 rows of 5 squares across. So we need a total of 30 2-inch squares. You can use Christmas fabric scraps. You can use your favorite Christmas fabrics. You can make it as scrappy or as cohesive as you want. But you'll need 30 of these 2-inch squares. So I'm using the same fabric for my lining as I am the outside, top and bottom of my Christmas stockings. So I also need to cut out 2 pieces of fabric for the lining of my Christmas stocking. In addition to that, I need to cut out a piece for the loop that we'll use to hang the Christmas stocking. And then we will also need to use some fusible fleece. Now I'm going to use fusible fleece on my exterior fabric and on the lining fabric. You can use fusible fleece on the exterior. You can use fusible foam. You can use, excuse me, you can use quilt batting, cotton batting, whatever your preferred interfacing batting choice is for your Christmas stocking. And then I'm also going to use the fusible fleece, so I have 4 pieces here, for my lining because I want my stockings to have a little bit of more stability or stiffness to them than just a lightweight like Pellon SF101. So I'm using this Pellon 987F fusible fleece for both the exterior of my Christmas stocking and for the lining. All right, once you have all your fabric pieces cut out and you have your fusible fleece cut out, the strap piece for your loop for hanging your stocking, then you have your 30 2-inch squares for the patchwork part. The very first thing that we're going to do is to sew these squares together. We're going to sew across in rows. So we'll do the first 2 squares. So we'll take these first 2 squares, lay them right side together, and stitch using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to use a narrow stitch length, 1.8 millimeter stitch length to piece these together. So I'll piece the first 2 together just like that. Then I'll take the second 2 pieces, and again, lay them right sides together and stitch using a 1/4 inch seam allowance to stitch these 2 together. Once I have those 2 together, all 4 pieces stitched together, I will stitch the 2 sets of 2 together, and then I will add my 5th 2-inch square to the end. Again, I'll show you all that as I go to stitch it. I just wanted to give you an overview of what we were going to do. So once we stitch 5 2-inch squares together in a row, we'll do 2 more rows for the front of the Christmas stocking, and then we'll do 3 more rows for the back of the Christmas stocking. Once we have those all stitched together, we're going to go and press the seams, and then we'll stitch the rows together. Rows 1 and 2, and then add row 3 to that, and then again we'll press our seams nice and flat, and we'll be ready to attach the patchwork to the top and the bottom of the Christmas stocking. When you cut out the fabric for your Christmas stocking, you will need to cut out 2 pieces of fabric for the Christmas stocking lining fabric. You will also need to cut out 2 pieces of the exterior fabric for the exterior portion of the Christmas stocking. Now remember, the exterior fabric will be 3 pattern pieces, one for the bottom of the stocking, one for the top, and then one is kind of a placeholder for the patchwork. Now to cut the squares out for the patchwork portion of the Christmas stocking, you will need 30 2-inch squares. So I'm using a strip ruler and cutting my fabric into 2-inch strips, and then I'll go back and cut those into 2-inch squares. And again, you need 15 2-inch squares for the front of the stocking, and you need 15 3-inch or 2-inch squares for the back of the stocking. Once you have your 2-inch squares cut out, you will want to lay them out in a grid as to how you would like to stitch these squares together. So I'm laying out 5 of the squares in the first row, 5 squares in the second row, and 5 squares in the third row. And once I have these all positioned the way that I want to sew them together, I will stack each of the squares up and take them to my sewing machine and stitch together using a 1.8 millimeter stitch length and a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So again, I'm just lining up my 2-inch squares, 15 of them for the front and 15 of them for the back of the stocking. And then I will take them over to my sewing machine to stitch them together. Let's take a look at that. Starting with the first row, I will take the first 2 squares and stitch them together. So lay the squares right side together, line up all the edges. You can pin these together if that is helpful to you, and then stitch them so that you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And again, I'm using a stitch length of 1.8 millimeters. So you stitch the first 2 squares together from the first row, and then you're going to stitch the second 2 squares, so squares 3 and 4 together for the first row. And then you'll take those 2 squares and stitch them together so you have 4 squares stitched together, again using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then once you have those 4 squares stitched together, you'll take the 5th square from that row, place it on the end, line up the edges, pin it in place, and stitch it using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then next, you are just going to repeat that for the second row of the 2-inch squares. Take the first 2 squares, lay them right sides together, line up your raw edges, and stitch together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You'll take the next 2 squares in that row, stitch them together, and then once you have the 2 sets of 2 squares, you will lay them right side together and stitch them together so that you have 4 squares in a row. And then you'll take the 5th square from that row and stitch it to your other 4 squares. Again, use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you'll have your 2 rows completed. And then you'll repeat the same thing for the third row of squares. So once you have your 3 rows of 2-inch squares sewn together, you're going to take those over to your ironing surface. And we're going to first of all set our seams. That just means you place the fabrics right sides together and you run your iron over the stitchings that you just did. And then we're going to press the seams from the first row all in the same direction, so to the left. So press all of your seam allowances towards the left in the first row of your squares. Then you'll flip that over and just gently press it from the right side. So for the second row, we'll lay it and we will set the seams as well for the second row of blocks. Then we'll turn it over to the wrong side and we want to press those rows of blocks so they all go the opposite direction. So we want those seam allowances to be pressed towards the right. The first row will press towards the left, the second row towards the right, and the third row back towards the left. That way, when we put these 3 rows together, the seams will all nest nicely, and it will help reduce the bulk where the seams join. So again, for the third row, I want to press all those seam allowances so they go towards the left. If you prefer to press your seams open, you can certainly do that. But with this small project, I find that pressing them in alternating directions works out pretty well. So line up my strips the way that I want them all sewn together. And here you can see my seams allowances are going in opposite directions. I'll lay the first 2 rows right sides together and stitch along the long edge. Once I've stitched rows 1 and 2 together, I will repeat that with the third row. So row 1, I'll flip row 2 up and over. I'm going to line up my seams and they will just kind of nest. You can feel it with your fingers when you rub your fingers over that seam allowance, that those seams just kind of nest into one another. Pin in place at each of the seams. And then once you have it pinned in place, you'll take it over to your sewing machine and you'll stitch that row together just like you did the squares using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So again, I have my sewing machine stitch length set to 1.8 millimeters and I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance to stitch rows 1 and 2 together. I am not back stitching at the beginning or the end. I'm just stitching the 2 rows together using a straight stitch. Once I have rows 1 and 2 stitched together, I will attach row 3. So lay the fabrics right sides together, line up the raw edges, pin in place at each of the seam intersections, and then stitch using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once we have our rows all stitched together, we're going to take this patchwork piece back to our ironing surface and I'm going to press my seams open this time. That's to just help reduce the bulk of all these seams intersecting. So stitch your first row of your seam allowance open and then stitch your second row seam allowance open as well. You just kind of take your fingers and press open the seam allowance and then use your iron to press that open. Now that I have both sections, the front and the back of the patchwork section for the Christmas stockings stitched together, I'm going to just trim them up a little bit. I'm going to use my ruler to line up my horizontal and vertical seams and then just trim so that the edges are even. And although it's not really necessary to square this piece up for the Christmas stocking pattern, when you get into quilting, make piecing blocks together for a quilt, it will be an important step to square up your pieces before you stitch them together. All right, once you have your patchwork section completed for the front and the back of the Christmas stockings, it is time to sew those patchwork pieces to the Christmas stocking top and bottom. So with the stocking exterior top piece laying right side up, lay your patchwork square down on top of it and center it. It's going to be slightly wider than that top piece. And you just want to center your patchwork piece on that piece of fabric. Clip it together. Make sure you have your fabric going the correct direction for how you want it laid out on your stocking. And once you have the top piece pinned together or clipped together with the patchwork piece, you'll do the same thing with the bottom of the Christmas stocking. And just again, center it over the patchwork squares and pin or clip it into place. Then we're going to take it over to the sewing machine and use a 1/4 inch seam allowance to stitch the top and bottom sections to the patchwork pieces. So again, with my stitch length set to 1.8 millimeter, I'm going to stitch the top of the Christmas stocking exterior piece to the patchwork piece using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and just removing my pins or clips as I sew along. Once I have the top piece stitched, I will flip this over and sew the bottom piece of the stocking to the patchwork piece. And I will repeat these steps for the other exterior pieces of the Christmas stocking. Once I have the pieces all stitched together, I'm going to take and press this fabric. I'm setting my seams first, just like we did with the patchwork squares. And then I'm going to press this seam allowance open. You can press it up if you want. You can press it so the seam goes down. But I thought it might lay better if I press the seam open. So I'm pressing the seam where the patchwork attaches to the top of the stocking open. And I'm also going to press the seam where the patchwork attaches to the bottom of the stocking so that that seam is open and nice and flat. Once I've pressed it, I'll turn it over to the right side and press it from the right side as well. Once I have that side done, I will repeat the same steps for the other stocking exterior piece. Remember to set the seams first, and then you will press those seams open where you're connecting the patchwork pieces to the top section of the exterior stocking and the bottom section of the exterior stocking. All right, once we have those exterior fabric pieces all pressed, we are ready to apply the fusible fleece. Now remember, I'm using fusible fleece on the lining pieces as well as the exterior pieces. So lay your cut out fusible fleece right side up. That would be the bumpy side of the fusible fleece. And then lay your lining piece wrong side down on top of that so the right side is up. And then follow the manufacturer's instructions for applying the fusible fleece to the fabric. Typically, you take your iron on the cotton setting, you press it against the fabric, hold it in place for 10 seconds, and move it around the fabric until you've covered the entire piece and the fleece is fused to your stocking piece. You do that with both lining pieces and both exterior fabric pieces. Like I said, we will apply the fusible fleece to both the lining and the exterior pieces. I'm just making sure that I have my seams where I sewed the top and the bottom to the patchwork sections that they're laying nice and flat. And then I will fuse that fleece to the back of the fabric and repeat that with the other exterior fabric piece. Next, I'm going to take my stockings, the exterior pieces, back over to my cutting surface so I can trim them up. I'm going to lay my pattern piece down on top of my Christmas stocking, lining up the top and the side edges. And you can see the patchwork pieces extend past the pattern, and this is what I want to trim. So I'm just going to line that up, lining it up with the bottom seam where the patchwork attaches to the bottom of the stocking, and use my rotary cutter and just trim off that excess fabric. You could also use scissors if you're not using a rotary cutter. And then repeat that with the other edge of the Christmas stocking. And you'll want to do that with the other exterior stocking piece as well. Next, we are going to do some quilting or top stitching of the exterior stocking piece. Here's a look at what I did on one of my stockings. I used a decorative stitch for above and below the patchwork pieces, and then using a 1/4 inch seam, I stitched a straight stitch down, kind of forming a square or a grid along all 15 of the patchwork pieces. So here I'm stitching out my decorative stitch. You do not have to use a decorative stitch. You can use a straight stitch, maybe using a 3.0 or 3.5 millimeter stitch length, and stitch 1/4 of an inch above and below the patchwork. That will help to keep that seam allowance nice and flat, and it gives your patchwork stocking a nice finished look. You do not have to do your quilting or your top stitching the way that I am doing it. You can do a straight line or a zigzag line, a decorative stitch. You can do diagonal, whatever that you would like to do. This is just how I did my Christmas stockings. If you have any questions about how to do your top stitching, which is really doing some quilting, just leave them in the comments and I'll be glad to answer them and see if I can help you. For the actual patchwork section, I am stitching 1/4 of an inch away from each of the seams, both vertically and horizontally. Now my sewing machine has what is called a locking stitch, and I'm using that at the beginning and the end of each one of my rows or columns of stitching. If your machine does not have a locking stitch, you can simply, when you start sewing, leave a nice long tail of thread, and then when you're through with the rows, go to the back side, the wrong side of your fabric, pull both ends of fabric or thread to the wrong side, and then tie them off in a knot and trim your threads. So I am just doing this 1/4 inch stitching of my patchwork squares for both the stocking front and the stocking back. And I'm only doing the stitching over the patchwork section. I'm not doing the quilting over the rest of the stocking, but you certainly can if you want to. Now next I am stitching the strap piece, the loop piece. I'm stitching really close to the edge, probably less than 1/4 of an inch down both long edges. Okay, I am sewing on the Janome Horizon Memory Craft 8200 QCP Special Edition sewing machine. And these are the settings that I use for the decorative stitching. It is mode 2, stitch number 82, and I'm using a 3.0 millimeter stitch length. It's kind of a leaf pattern, and I just thought it was just adorable for this Christmas stocking. You can use any decorative stitch that your machine has, or like I said, you can just do some straight stitching. Once you're through with the quilting process, this is going to go really quickly. And what you're going to do is take the two exterior fabric pieces and lay them right sides together. Then you want to line up your patchwork seams, maybe where you attach the patchwork to the top and the patchwork to the bottom of the stocking, and pin or clip those in place. And then you're just going to take it over to your sewing machine and stitch that together. You'll do the same thing with the lining pieces. Lay them right sides together and pin or clip them in place. Now, when you stitch the lining pieces together, we're going to leave an opening for turning. But first, we need to stitch the exterior fabric pieces together using a 3/8 to 1/2 inch seam allowance. We will stitch around the entire perimeter of the Christmas stocking. Be sure to back stitch at the beginning and the end to secure your stitches. And then we will stitch the lining piece. Now remember, along the back of the lining, we want to stop so that we can leave an opening for turning. So I'm stitching along the bottom, up the hill, and then I'm going to stop, back stitch, move over about 3 inches, and continue stitching, back stitching again. Now you want to clip your seams and curves on your stocking. You can use pinking shears, or you can just take your scissors and trim the seam allowance down to 1/4 of an inch and then clip your curves. And I am doing the same thing with the lining piece, trimming that seam allowance down to 1/4 of an inch. And then I'm just cutting out around the curve so that the stocking piece will lay more smoothly when I turn it right side out and put these pieces together. Now I'll leave the lining piece wrong side out. I will turn my exterior piece right side out and kind of smooth it out so it's laying nice and flat. Then I'm going to take my loop and I'm going to pin or clip it in place so that it is lined up with the back seam of the stocking. Be sure to open up that seam and pin that in place. Now my sewing machine has an extension table, and I'm going to remove the extension table to make it easier for sewing the top of the stocking. First, I basted the loop to the stocking. And I have my stocking piece, the exterior piece inside the lining, right sides together. I'm lining up my side seams, pinning them in place or clipping them in place, and I'm stitching using a 1/2 inch seam allowance along the entire perimeter of the Christmas stocking, making sure the front and back seams are open. Then turn the stocking right side out through the opening in the lining. Once I have this stocking turned right side out, I'm going to sew the lining opening closed. You can do this by hand or you can do it on your sewing machine. I'm going to do it on my sewing machine. Just pushing the seam allowance inside, clipping it together, and stitching about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, back stitching at the beginning and the end, trimming off my threads, and then I'm just going to stuff the lining down into the stocking piece, using my hand to smooth it out and put it into place. Once I have that top seam laying nice and flat, I'm going to take it back to my sewing machine, stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge using a 3.0 millimeter stitch length and stitch along the perimeter of this Christmas stocking. Once I've done that, I'm going to stitch a second row of top stitching 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, again using a 3.0 millimeter stitch length. And there we have finished the Christmas stocking. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please be sure to like it, subscribe to my YouTube channel if you found it helpful, and come visit me over on the Hooked on Sewing blog and subscribe to my newsletter. Thank you. If you're participating in the sew along, be sure to check out my supplies and tools video, the Cora Book Sleeve tutorial video, and also the Pearl Tote Bag tutorial. The Patchwork Christmas Stocking was the third and final pattern that we stitched together in the September sew along.